So in this second half of our discussion of the artifacts, I'm going to move on from the what we call the arrowheads, the projectile points, the things made in this flaking technique, these bifaces, to another class of artifact made in a very different way. And so we're going to look at these, which also tell us different stories about the lives of the people who made and used them. So the objects I'm going to talk about now were made with a different technique, not with this chipping technique, but with a technique that's called pecking and grinding. And this technology came in around 7,000 years ago. So these earliest points that I show you, the people who used this Dalton point and the LaCroix point, did not have this technology. This comes in somewhat later. And the basic idea is that you find a piece of stone, probably in a river or a creek, that's something of the size and shape that you want your final object to be. And then you begin grinding it and shaping it by rubbing it on other rocks with sand and water. It takes probably a long time to do. And at the same time, if you want to do some particular shaping of the object, you may do what's called pecking. And this object, as you can see here, has all these little dimples over the surface of this part of it. And in fact, you can see this is like a groove all the way around this part of the object. And this has been created by somebody using another stone like this and pecking away at it to pulverize the stone to make the shape that they want. Again, you can imagine this is something that takes a while to do, but it enabled the American Indians of that time to make some very different tools than they'd had before and to do very different things with them. And this is the most common type of tool made in this technique, and it's what we call a grooved axe. This is the groove, and here is the axe part, and the back part often shows signs of having been used as a hammer as well. So it's a multi-purpose tool. It's an axe hammer, really. And this one, as you can see, is partly smooth on the surface, but over most of it, you can see the pecking that they've done to get it to the final shape that they want. But you can see that the end here, the actual blade, the business end, if you like, has been polished and smoothed to make it as sharp as possible. Now, this picture here gives you a good sense of how these things were actually put into a handle or a shaft so that they could be used. The groove is to hold a piece of wood or a sapling, curved wood, or possibly rawhide leather, to hold it tight, and then that would be joined to a shaft and the whole thing wrapped around with cord or with rawhide to hold it really, really firmly in the handle. And they also may have been able to use some glues from animal bones and from other materials to help it stick together. So this gives you some idea of the scale of this one. Each one of these is an inch. They come in various shapes and sizes. Some of them are much bigger than this, and some of them much smaller. This is a pretty good average grooved axe, I'd say. And we find these all over the place. They're found widely scattered over the landscape. And you might say, well, firstly, what is it made of? Well, this one is made of argillite, local argillite, like we said with the arrowhead. So it's probably been pulled from one of the local streams around here and shaped and made into this object. And it's pretty clear that these objects are indeed axes. They are for cutting. Now, in the past, of course, we might have said, oh, well, they're war axes or some kind of weapon. And they could certainly have been used that way, but it's almost certain that the major use of them was for cutting up wood. What this is telling us is that these people at this time were living in probably a very wooded environment, almost completely forested, and they were using these forest resources in a whole range of ways to improve their quality of life. They're just getting better at cutting up wood, cutting down trees. You can cut down trees with these things, not very big trees, but trees, and for cutting the wood up into shapes for firewood or for many other purposes. So this rather ordinary looking object is telling us that people are gaining more control over their environment at this time. As I said, about 7,000 years ago and later. So that's one example of a woodworking tool. And here is another one that looks similar when you first look at it, but when we look at it closely, we can see it's again slightly different. It has a slightly different purpose and is also sending us messages as to about what these people were doing. As you can see, it looks a bit like the axe we just looked at. It has this groove on it, very nicely made. This is made of a sort of sandstone of some kind. Not quite sure where this comes from, the actual rock. And it looks like an axe. It has an edge here. But when you look at it sideways on, like this, you can see that the bottom is flat and this part is sort of curved down. Quite unlike this one, you see, which is the same kind of shape in section, whereas this one has this flat base. So this is not an axe. This is another kind of tool closely related called an adze, A-D-Z-E. And this is a woodworking tool as well, but it really is a woodworking tool, not just a sort of let's chop up wood kind of tool, although that one could probably be used for other purposes too. But this kind of object would have been held in a shaft like this, or like that. And instead of being used like that, it's used like this. It's more like, well, there still are exactly tools like this today, adzes that woodworkers use, for hollowing out, particularly, hollowing out pieces of wood, chopping and shaping wood. And one obvious use that we might think of for this is in the construction of dugout canoes. Hollowing out a tree that might have been cut down with an axe like this, and then using this adze to actually start the real process of shaping and chipping it into the fine shape that you want. And it's quite possible, of course, that these tools were used not just for utilitarian objects, but for what we might think of as art objects or ritual objects. Of course, we don't have any of these objects anymore because they're all made of organic materials which have long since rotted away. So we're only left with part of the story with these stone tools, and we have to try and imagine some of the other materials and objects that would have been used at the time. So that's a grooved axe and a grooved adze. And going back to the axes for a moment, we after a couple of millennia, a new style of axe comes in, which was simpler. This is a simpler one. As you can see, the main thing is it does not have a groove in it at all. And it's really beautiful. They're usually beautifully smoothed like this. This is a particularly fine example made of a stone called basalt, which from a bit north of here, I think. As you can see, the back of it's been broken off a very long time ago because it's all sort of worn down. But the front is still quite good. There's one chip out of the blade here. And these kind of axes, we know from finding examples in places like Florida where the ground is wet and you get the preservation of wood, that they were put like this into a solid wooden handle that a hole was made in, and then they were wedged through that hole. So it's a much simpler technique, really, and probably was quicker to make these. And archaeologists call these Celts, C-E-L-T-S, for no very good reason that I know. But anyway, these are Celts, and these are grooved axes. And these ones going on being used, again, you might well have found tools like this being used by the Lenape people at the time that Europeans first arrived. And here's a smaller one, but again, exactly the same kind of idea, really beautifully smoothed and made. And we have dozens and dozens of these kind of objects in our collections. And you may say, well, why were they abandoned? Why did the people lose them or drop them? And of course, we don't really know that. In some cases, you can clearly see that the objects got broken, and they said, oh, it's not even worth fixing this, and they just discarded it. But this one, for example, is, it's incomplete and intact. So, why was it abandoned? We don't know, and we can speculate, of course. But they were obviously very commonly used. Everybody, most people had them and were using them in their everyday lives. Now we come on to some rather more intriguing other kinds of objects, which when you first look at them, you can't necessarily work out what they were for. I'd like to start with this one, which in some ways hardly looks like an artifact at all. It's rather crude. Again, it's made of local argillite. You can see it's this sort of greenish, grey, rather sort of weathered-looking material. And at first glance, you might think, well, it's just a stone. But you can actually see, when you look carefully, that it's been shaped here and made into this sort of paddle-like, almost like a paddle-like shape. The back has been not as worked as much as the front, so it's nothing like as many person hours have been spent on making this as making this, and so we can ask, well, yes, it's an artifact. What is it for? The most likely explanation, and I'm quite happy with this, and it's been demonstrated by other discoveries, is that this is a hoe. It's an agricultural implement, and it would have been mounted in a wooden shaft coming back this way, so you can use it as a digging tool like this, and to scrape dirt around and do things like that. So this, humble as it looks and not all that finely made, is a really significant artifact, because it is telling us that the people who made this are not just hunting and gathering food anymore. They are now cultivating crops. We should probably think of what they're doing as something more like gardening than farming. They don't have plows. They don't have any animals like oxen or horses. So it's all hand agriculture in what we might think of or look at as garden plots, although the Europeans, when they came, did describe them as fields. They are, fairly extensive areas. So this is quite a revolution, and this is probably happening around 1,000 years ago in this area. The idea of really cultivating crops rather than just going out and grabbing them as caught on around here. Now, the other very interesting thing about this object is that we can, what we call, engender it. We can give it a sex, if you like, because we know from the early accounts of when Europeans first met American Indians on the east coast of what's now the US, they found out that the people who used these hoes were the women. This is a woman's tool. Probably if the person who made and used this could see me handling it now, she'd be horrified, because it's not something that I'm supposed to be handling. It's a woman's tool. The women are the ones that do the cultivating and nurturing of the crops, growing the three main crops that they had: maize, corn, beans, and different kinds of squashes. And they grew them together in threes, and they called them the Three Sisters. And this is a tool that had been used to weed and aerate the soil and all those kind of tasks around the crops. So an object like this is from the last 1,000 years or so, and is telling us about quite a revolution in the way people were living. Not to say that people were not still hunting and gathering as well. They weren't completely relying on these grown crops, but it was a big factor in in encouraging people to sort of settle down more perhaps into semi-permanent villages. And we know the locations of a couple of these in the Hopewell area that were here when Europeans arrived, and we even know their names. Wissaminson and Menapanaskon. And there were undoubtedly others as well around the area. So sticking for a moment with what is probably more of a female tool than a male tool, this is, again, a very common type of discovery. And again, you might, when you first look at it, think, well, it's just a long kind of tubular stone. It's not actually an artifact that somebody has made. But the more closely you look at it, you can see it's got this pecking technology on it, like we saw with the grooved axe. And you can clearly see that the ends are sort of battered. They're a bit damaged, particularly this end is sort of damaged. And this is a pestle. It's a grinding stone. It's a pounding stone. And what would go with it would be a big hollowed out stone or possibly a piece of wood that you can mash up, mostly, vegetable foods, to prepare them in food preparation. And of course, we still use pestle and mortars today. Some culinary traditions use them a lot for herbs and particularly for spices. So this is a type of object that we can relate to, fairly well. But these next two objects that I'm going to kind of finish up with are not so easily understood, and it takes a bit of thought and research to know what they are. The first type are these little rocks. They're just pebbles that have been taken out of a local stream, and they have a groove around them like this, made in the same way as the one we saw on the grooved axe. And they've often got sort of battering marks on the edges as well, like this one does here. You can see it's been sort of battered and picked out. And here's another one, and the groove hasn't gone all the way round here. So these are grooved stones. Well, so what could we think about these? The groove, of course, is giving us a clue that there's something has been attached. These are intended to be attached to something fibrous, something vegetable matter, or perhaps, some kind of plant material that's going to be used to hold it in some way. And again, by looking at modern analogies of hunting, gathering peoples, we can be pretty sure that these are what are called bolas stones. And the idea is you have several of these attached on a rope, and you swing them like this, and you throw them towards the animal that you're hoping to catch. And these things you can knock birds out of the air with it. Think geese, large birds, throw them up when they're migrating, or even deer. You could probably trip up a deer with one of these things, and then go up quickly and knock it on the head with this. And there's your dinner. So these are another hunting tool, really, bolas stones. And again, they're quite common, so they were obviously used a lot. And it's quite easy to see how these would get lost. You throw it, you miss, and it disappears into the undergrowth, and you say, I could pretty easily make another one of these. So not surprising that we find quite a large number of those. Then I want to just finish up with a particularly interesting and often very beautiful kind of artifact, of which we have a number here. We're not sure whether these are local, really. They look as if they might have come from somewhere outside this area, but they would have been used here also. So let me pick up the most attractive looking one first. You can see there's a nice groove here, and it's broken, obviously. So what we deduce is that this was originally, the other half of this object looked exactly like this one. So it's it's a sort of almost like a tail-like looking object with a hole drilled through the middle. This one is made of a very nice, some kind of sedimentary, almost marbly rock. You can see the sort of veins of different kinds of colors running through this, and it's being very, very carefully made. It's a beautiful, beautiful object, and other examples of these are much more elaborate, not from around here, but there are very elaborate examples of this with this. But the key thing is this hole through the middle. Now we're lucky, actually, in our collections, we have 2 of these made of different stone that were never finished, but at least we start to get some idea of what the finished object would look like. Here you can see the two halves, obviously the 2 sides like we saw with the other one, and the thick part in the middle where the hole was obviously supposed to go, but for some reason they didn't make it. They never made the hole. They discarded this before they did that. And then this one, they've started it but never finished. You can see the little hole here in one end, where they hold it like this, and they've got a little another stone tool, and they're doing this kind of thing with sand to drill all the way through. So what on earth is this thing for? What is it? Well, again, we can work this out by having seen examples that still have their the wooden shaft through them, and again from examples of other peoples, hunting and gathering peoples who use similar things. But I think what is really probably exciting about these objects is that I think they had probably, to the people who made and used them, a sort of spiritual dimension. What they actually are is they function as a counterweight. Now, I haven't got a good example of how this worked, but before there were bows and arrows, what you had were long spears, but you were able to throw them further and harder by using a stick with a curve on the end of it called an atlatl, or a spear thrower. So you would put the spear onto the spear thrower, and you do this, and you get more leverage, and the spear goes further and harder. And these things were put on the back of the spear thrower to counterbalance the weight of the heavy spearhead at the end of the spear. And probably also to steady the hand of the hunter. You have to imagine that the hunters with these things are probably standing very, very still for long periods of time, waiting for the deer to come out of the woods so you can actually see it, and hoping not to frighten it away. And so this stone, the atlatl weight, or banner stone as they're sometimes called, would probably help to take the strain of keeping you still. And my guess, and the guess of other archaeologists, is that also they felt that these objects had the ability, to help you guide your spear better. They were sort of, they had some power to help you hunt well. And this is why we think they were obviously had such time and care taken on them to make them into these beautiful, not really very functional. They don't have to be as elaborate as this, but they clearly were felt to be very, very important. So I hope that's given you some clue and some insight into the sort of materials that we have here in the Hopewell Museum from the American Indians who lived in this area for so many thousands of years, and some of the stories that we can begin to learn from these objects about these people who were here and whose ancestors, of course, descendants, I should say, are still here in New Jersey today. The Indians have not disappeared, we just don't notice them as much as we would have done in the past. Thank you very much.